One of the things that may be noted about my channel is that I don't make a practice of reviewing fantasy style weapons, and there's good reason for that. My focus is always on reviewing an item for its functionality, its aesthetics, and its value as an actual functional weapon. And so many fantasy weapons that are out there are designed strictly with decoration in mind or visual appeal. They are implemented with inferior materials such as stainless steel, all for the purpose of being able to be hung on a wall, to look very pretty, but not necessarily to be functional or usable. And that really discounts it from me ever taking a look at it. All that said, it's not that I'm opposed to the concept of fantasy weapons. Certainly, it's much harder to review them within context of actual usage, but every once in a while one comes along where I can do that. And we're going to see that today when I look at this custom spear designed by Chaosism and implemented by Sabersmith. Because this spear was custom designed, there's not necessarily a lot to say in terms of description, and because it's fantasy, there really isn't a lot of historical basis for me to really speak to in terms of a long description. So I will probably just jump right into my thoughts on it. And certainly there's going to be a bit of a change up in the way I do review. So I always speak to functionality and aesthetics. I'm going to have to speak to two other things in addition to that. One is design, how well it is designed for the purposes that it's supposed to be built for, and then implementation, that is how well it is implemented upon that design. And that's really important to note because when you're talking about custom weapons, you have to be able to speak to a maker's ability to execute on a vision, as well as that vision can actually work properly. So that can in some ways be disjointed from the idea of functionality. Let's actually start with aesthetics. For me, the aesthetics of this aren't necessarily what I would call my cup of tea. I am not really one who is a huge fan of fantasy styled weapons. What I mean by this is weapons that are designed to an aesthetic point without a lot of necessary purpose behind them. That is to say that a lot of times weapons had visual flair, but there was something that was done to make it stand out that wasn't necessarily done just for the purposes of being visually different. The example I would give is actually these wings here on the spear, where they are designed to almost look a little bit like bat wings or dragon wings. And this is not necessarily something you would see a lot of because it might actually impact functionality, as I'll speak to in a bit here, but it's certainly a visual flair. And when I look at this, I actually see a visual flair that you would associate almost with movies to have come from the 1980s, those kind of early fantasy movies that look to make something just very visually stark and different, but not necessarily always comprehensible in a functional manner. But it's perfectly well implemented. It looks nice for what it is. It's, again, not necessarily something that I would appreciate. With the person who designed this using a screen name Chaosism, well, chaos being the root there, perhaps this is exactly what was being targeted here, was something that looks a little bit evil, a little bit haphazard. But not to say that the implementation is haphazard. In fact, it's very even, very clean. There's a little bit of etching right here on the blade. It's a laser etching from what I can tell because it's extremely clean. It looks really nice. And overall, when it comes to the metal fittings, all the blade pieces, it's extremely clean. It's extremely nice. This is not to be unexpected. Sabersmith has a very, very specific visual flair they go for, but they do it very well. It's implemented in a very, very clean fashion. Likewise, when you look at something like their leather wrapping, this is actually kind of one of their big key things. When you see a Sabersmith weapon, the leather wrapping design is something that immediately stands out. You kind of recognize it as being something they do, and it's perfectly fine. It looks nice. I find it a little bit odd visually that it breaks up, that you have this piece in the middle. I understand that it's kind of intended so you can grip it. but the breakup looks a little bit strange. It would almost have been good just to do leather down the entire length of it and just act as some sort of reinforcement, as allowing it to just kind of have no real visual break. That's a personal opinion on the design, not to say that it isn't, again, intended to be that way. I am a pretty big fan of the concept that they were going for, both Chaosism and Sabersmith were going for in the design, in terms of just general fantasy look. A double-sided spear is certainly something that seems appealing, and visually it can be striking. I mentioned this in my first impressions review when I referenced Marvel superheroes, or rather supervillains, that use similar type weapons. All that said, aesthetically, yeah, I think it's exactly what was being targeted, more or less. But the problem is that these aesthetics can then have some impact on design intent, and I'll speak to that in a moment. But let's actually speak a bit about functionality first. So as far as functionality is concerned, it works pretty darn well as a spear. The broad tip on this is designed really perfectly for getting a good thrust in there. Very often when you have a broad spear tip, the way that it actually tapers to a point is extremely important, because it has to be able to allow that kind of forward momentum that the spear has and pierce through a target. Now, I really only targeted water bottles, and those are really very easy to pierce, but certainly the broad head can get through quite a lot, and that's because of how it tapers to a point. You'll see this really on pretty much any major spear of this kind of design. Historically speaking, it's really no different. I do find it a little bit interesting. There is kind of a rigid element to it. I don't know that is necessarily as apparent in a lot of historical models, although I do know that it did exist, and that helps to give some rigidity to the spear point, and to allow that thrust to never really bend or allow any of that energy to be lost in any specific kind of way. The wings also work like you would expect them to for the most part. However, I will note that because of how this spear is implemented in terms of having it kind of end at this cylindrical shaft here, it really means that actually stops the target. When I was doing things like piercing water bottles, it would hit and it would go through because it's a water bottle and it will actually kind of bend in. But on any kind of more solid target, that would actually probably stop it. These wings would therefore become really kind of purposeless. They wouldn't really have any value like they would on a boar spear, where it's meant to actually prevent the spear from going too far into the body, so you can't really retrieve it as easily. Now, the blade aspect of the spear tip is something I wanted to test out. Specifically, the design of this called for the ability for it to act kind of like a halberd to some extent, so you could actually make some cutting motion with it. I did test that. It did work to that extent. It certainly sliced through bottles very, very easily. I will say there's a couple things that begin to hinder this. One is there's actually not a lot of length on this on the spear tip to actually act as a cutting edge, which means you're really only going to be doing pretty shallow cuts. While it is, I would say, about 6 inches long, 5 to 6 inches long on the cutting portion, in a sweeping motion, especially with such a long shaft, you're really only going to be effectively using maybe 2 or 3 inches from the tip of that. Otherwise, you might get it caught, or you might just hit something and it's going to just bounce off. It's not really going to act as a slicing mechanism. That's okay. Again, it's a spear, not necessarily meant for that, but because that action is called out as a design, it's important to note. Another problem with that is actually the round shaft. Because it is perfectly round, there's no real good way to determine edge alignment. I had to really kind of cheat this. I would take time, I'd really line up my shot, I'd think about and make sure my hands were perfectly aligned, but honestly, in the process of using it, it's very easy to get misaligned. I noted this when I was doing the cut, because I wanted to try something that was kind of trading end for end, that is thrusting with one end and then sweeping around for a cut in the other, and you can actually see in the camera I don't have good edge alignment there. That's really just kind of the nature of it. It's really hard to have edge alignment when you can't feel where the edge is going to be with your hands. One thing that is also noted about the design elements in terms of functionality is the ability to choke up to get point control. All that's fine, and you get a little bit of protection of the hands, etc. There's also a call for reaching up across the edge of the wings here and gripping the blade like I am right now. But there are some major design failures that actually prevent that from being a real functional element for it. And I'll speak to that when I speak about design. Now, I do want to take a moment to speak to implementation, because I do feel like Sabersmith executed on the design as well as they could. There are certain elements of design that were not met. I will throw up some images of what was designed versus what was actually implemented. And for the most part, they're actually fairly minor things. Certainly like placing of an etching, etc. And I think there was some expectation of how that could work, but it may not always happen the way that you'd want in a design. That's worth noting in terms of working with a custom maker, is that sometimes they can't do exactly what you might have envisioned, or how they would do it might actually have some more negative impact. So yeah, the implementation I think is more or less spot on with design intent and more or less the large brush strokes of how this thing was intended to be put together. And again, Sabersmith did it very well. Their implementation is sturdy, clean. I have no problems with it. It doesn't fall apart. When we speak, however, about the design, this is where I really begin to struggle with it, because how it is meant to be used versus how you're able to use it and some of the pitfalls there within are really important to note here. So I'm going to speak with it kind of within its various purposes. First, as a spear. As a spear, there's kind of two theoretical purposes with a spear. One is just to hold it like a spear and get a good thrust in. And when you're thrusting at something, it's fine. However, any kind of extended thrust where you're really trying to push through, you've got this whole other pointy sharp end here that then puts you at risk. Likewise, if you're around anyone, and I think about something like battlefield formations with a spear, maybe not so much. You could certainly hurt someone behind you. As a solo effort, yes, it could work as a spear, but again, I don't like the idea of having sharp things here that when I'm withdrawing could snag, catch, or even injure me. Of course, another kind of functional aspect of a spear is the ability for it to be thrown. Now, this is actually something of a misconception. Most people wouldn't actually throw their spears. That's what a javelin is for. And certainly most of the time the spear is thrown, it's done for the purposes of acting like a javelin. But spears can be thrown. I have a concern with this for one very specific reason. That is, the way you tend to throw a spear tends to go off and kind of over your arm that's out. And the problem is you've got all this stuff to then hook your hand as it flies through the air, which means that when you throw it, you really have to drop down almost out of the way too quickly. Now, I didn't actually test this for a couple of reasons. One is I didn't want to risk me throwing this and it hitting a rock or breaking. I don't want to do that to someone else's weapon. The other one is I feel like it was too much of a risk. I didn't want to risk having any of this kind of grab me or cut me as it went by, so I opted out of that option. And certainly I did that because, of course, it's a fantasy spear. It's meant to really be held and used as a hand weapon, not really thrown. So I just wanted to call that out because, yes, while spears can technically be thrown, I don't think this one is one that should be, and I still think it's a little bit of a misconception of how spears really are used. With the ability to choke up on it to get good point control, this is something that was specifically called out. I think that's fine. I have no real problem with that. However, the concept of moving your hand up onto or past the wings and more onto the blade is something that I would honestly never do. One reason for that is you can see my hand is a little bit too large for this. I can't actually grip all the way around it for a couple of reasons. One is, as my hand wants to kind of expand outward when I grip, it would go onto the blade. The second reason is these wing tips here are extremely sharp, and to grab in on that, it's actually poking right into the soft part of the base of my thumb. Also, transitioning to that is extremely dangerous. I've actually cut myself now a couple of times trying to do that transition in any kind of smooth way. You'd have to have some pretty rugged gloves, and then you're still going to be caught with the problem of not really being able to hold onto the blade. Now you can maybe cheat it by putting your finger around it, but it doesn't feel real comfortable. I feel like the implementation of these wings, the design, again, the aesthetic choice, actually more than anything, to go really pointy here, actually prevents it from being used in that manner. These wings would have to be much wider, in my opinion, to actually be usable and functional in that manner, and I don't think it's necessary, and here's why. When you're grabbing up here, you're already choking this far up, you have extremely good point control. The gain of another 3 inches isn't really going to give you any substantial gains in terms of functionality and use. I would always keep my hand behind the guard for a lot of different reasons. One is your hands are well guarded, and the other one is, well, to put it on the other side, you actually risk injuring yourself with the weapon that you're using, not even your opponent's weapon. Finally, one concept of this spear, and this is not necessarily something that you would associate with a boar spear, but is a concept that has been espoused a few times and is certainly an intent of this design, is the ability to then hook a shield with it, with these wings, and to actually reach out, grab a shield, pull so that shield drops down, and then thrust through. The idea is if someone has a shield very high, you can actually pull it down and get an angle on either their chest or head, and then you make the strike. It works well for that, as far as I can tell. I've tried it on some of my shields, just kind of hooking and seeing how well it does hook. This back portion here, because it does have a little bit of a lip, it does grab perfectly fine. It's not entirely perfect, and I think you do actually have to have kind of almost a 45-degree pull on it for it to really kind of latch as you really want it to. Thinner shields, or shields with lips that are not as easily hookable, it just kind of slides off of it. Doesn't really quite work as well as you'd want in just kind of a straight, almost perpendicular pulling action. But certainly at 45 degrees, it will yank that down, that you can, again, thrust out. So I think that overall, this is a very interesting fantasy weapon. It's got some drawbacks, and some of these drawbacks are specific to how it's been designed visually, the aesthetics of it, that is, how the wings are designed. Not really so much how the blade piece is designed. I know that this kind of ricasso piece of the spear tip is meant so you can grip it, but again, it doesn't really add any real value. I feel like the implementation right here, where the blade meets the shaft, could have been done a little bit better, and it's a little bit plain, and that plainness actually also hinders its ability to be used functionally. Overall, it's a very interesting concept, very interesting design. I think that its functionality still stands pretty heavily in the realm of fantasy, and you're not really going to ever see anything like this be functional, or at least usable in kind of a traditional sense. I think as soon as you were to do something like break away the other pointy end of this spear and allow it just to be used as just as a standard boar spear, suddenly it becomes a lot more functional as a boar spear. And I think that that's one of the interesting things to come from this. It's an interesting element and philosophy of designing a fantasy weapon is, can you really actually improve upon what we know was done historically speaking? And I think what we find a lot of times is that the historical models exist for a reason, because they worked. And if someone tried something kind of wacky and fantastical as this, that's actually probably did happen, but it just wouldn't have kind of stood the test of time, and no one would really choose that weapon over another simply because of some of its failings. So this isn't a perfect weapon. I do think it's well implemented. I do think Sabersmith did a good kind of design to implementation. I think the design itself isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. I do think it has some pitfalls. Interesting weapon, interesting thing, custom weapon, and certainly I think Chaosism will enjoy having this. I think he'll enjoy playing around with it. I would just recommend that he tries to keep himself as safe as possible, because there are a little bit of pitfalls here. So yeah, that about wraps it up. I do think it's a very interesting weapon, and I think if you're looking for something with this kind of visual design, custom made, maybe Sabersmith is the company to go for, because they do have a very specific visual flair, and it can fit fantasy weapons pretty well. So this is the custom fantasy spear designed by Chaosism and implemented by Sabersmith. I hope you enjoyed this review. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can also check out Medieval Review on Patreon.